Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm George, and today I'm here outside Hampton Court, which is a historical palace, the original residence of King Henry VIII and his children, and right up until the Georgian kings of England lived there as well. So a very historical part of London. And the weather today is 30 degrees, so it's really nice and hot, and a lot of people swimming in the water, a lot of people out on boats. And I'm just going to paint a scene of the river behind me. There's a boat which I'm going to include in the foreground, and then get some of the small boats going past up and down this part of the River Thames. If that sounds interesting, remember, subscribe to my channel and let's start painting. So I'm all set up and ready to paint. I'm painting on a plywood panel which has been toned and sealed and primed. I've also applied a wash of raw umber paint to the surface just to take away some of that brilliant white, which can be a bit distracting when you're putting your first mixes of colour onto the panel. And this panel is actually going to become available soon on my Etsy shop, which is Alla Prima Art Carrier on Etsy. And these will be available. You can buy a range of different kits to carry your wet paintings, so look out for those. If they are available by the time this video is released, I'll put a link in the description. If not, just keep an eye on that Etsy shop, because these are the panels which I use, and they're great, so I'd recommend them. And I've also set up my palette here. So I'm using titanium white, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, yellow ochre, raw umber, alizarin crimson, permanent green, cerulean blue, viridian green, and ultramarine blue. So I'm not using any black on the palette. I tend not to like using black in general, especially on plein air, as I try to keep as much colour in the shadows as possible. And the medium I'm using today is just Sansidor, which is a low odour artist solvent to mix the paints. And as you can see, this boat in the foreground is now moving, so I did quite like it in the composition, but I'm going to wait till it moves away before I start painting, so I can get a nice view of the river behind it. And yeah, please do subscribe to my channel, and let's start painting. I've painted a simple grid onto the panel, dividing it vertically and horizontally. This helps me place the main lines of the composition in the correct position in relation to the other compositional lines. I'm now painting in the shadow shapes within the trees. I'm using a colour mix of ultramarine blue and raw umber paint to paint these dark shadows in the trees. I'm now starting to paint in the sky, and when I observe the sky I can see a distinct shift in colour temperature as the sky is lighter and warmer immediately above the horizon, and it gradually takes on a deeper blue hue as the sky gets higher up. In order to capture this effect, I mix one warm grey mix consisting of ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and a touch of alizarin crimson and some titanium white. I then make a separate colour mix on my palette for the upper section of the sky using titanium white, ultramarine blue, turquoise, and a small touch of raw umber just to neutralise the chroma of the blue a little bit. I then mix an intermediate colour mix, and using mostly vertical brush strokes, I blend these mixes onto the panel to create this atmospheric effect in the sky. Here I'm painting in the lightest sections of the cloud, using a brush loaded with titanium white and a small touch of cadmium yellow just to give those lights a slight bit of warmth to capture the sunlight shining onto the clouds. And I try to leave a few sections of the canvas blank where I place the clouds, as it's easier to paint fresh paint on top of a dry canvas to avoid the new paint mixing with the paint underneath. In the instance of these white clouds, if the white mixes with the blue, the white's suddenly going to become a lot cooler and also not as light. When painting clouds, it's important to keep the edges quite soft, especially the bottom part of the cloud, which tends to softly merge into the sky. And in general, when painting, I find it's better to paint more soft edges than it is sharp edges as when we look at stuff in detail, as our eyes flick across the scene, it's easy to see things as quite sharp shapes, and there is a tendency to overdo this. Whereas if you keep the edges quite soft and the brush strokes breaking over the lines of the contours, you can actually create a much more realistic effect, as when you look at a scene, you don't see everything in sharp, you only see the thing which your eye is focusing on in sharp focus. So my advice would be to err on the side of painting too soft than too sharp. Here I'm painting the sections of the trees which are catching the sunlight. To make this colour mix I'm using yellow ochre and some ultramarine blue and a touch of titanium white and cadmium yellow. To paint the water, I created a colour mix of ultramarine blue, titanium white and a small amount of raw umber and alizarin crimson, which I increase as the water approaches the foreground and takes on a darker value with a warmer tone. Here I'm painting the reflection of the trees into the water, and I find it useful to remember that the reflected image will always be a bit darker and a bit less chromatic to that which it is reflecting. And I'm now using a filbert brush to paint these horizontal dashes of paint to capture the surface of the water. So when you're confronted with a complex section of the scene, such as these reeds and foliage on the riverbank in the foreground, which has a large amount of fine intricacies, it can be quite overwhelming, and it's sometimes hard to know where to start. So here I've
thinly applied some dark green sections within the foliage. I can then paint the lighter sections around these to get the overall impression. Similar to what I see when I squint. From there I can add finer details with a pointed brush to finally paint some individual reeds, as well as pick out some darker accents within the shadows. I'm now painting in a few figures who've been standing on this small dock and jumping into the water, and I'm using a fine round brush just to paint the general hue and value of the figures, as they're so small I can't really get much detail, but by getting the colour and the value accurately and the scale on the painting, it instantly gives us the impression of the figures. And I'm also painting a few figures swimming in the river.
Whilst I've been painting, I've seen a lot of people jumping in to the water, and as it's pretty hot today, I figured I'm going to jump in and go for a quick swim in the Thames. And pretty nice. It's cold but not too cold. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you're looking to go swimming in the Thames in London, then probably around Hampton Court, it's quite a good place to swim. I wouldn't go anywhere in East London because it's probably terribly dirty. Definitely in Central London it's very dirty, so West London, on a sunny day, not a bad spot to swim.